Thousands of stories shall be told within these halls. I am here to tell you 20. I am your storyteller. In bygone times, in lands not so far away, a young lad by the name of Fred was experimenting with activist performance artists, as one does. And when not doing that, he could be found concocting feminist computer viruses that would infect the internet, or smuggling deactivated AK-47s over the German border, all in the name of art, of course. Karma then waved her fair hand, and Fred spent an arduous summer of repent, cloistered away, cataloging women's clothing, wigs, and high-heeled shoes. But 5 years later, epiphany struck. Fred realized there must be some other way to express his creative energy. And it was then, one fateful summer's dawn, that he found IDEO. To the stage now, ladies and gentlemen, is Fred Dust.
So I do have to say, it's a little hard when you have the person who's introducing you is actually a hard act to follow, and that's how I feel this morning. I'm going to start by telling you a kind of a very personal story. Hold on, let me just make sure the first slide's up. Oh. So one of the hardest questions I get asked is one of the questions I get asked almost every day, which is, what do you do? And typically when I get asked this question, I'll hem and haw for a little bit, and then finally I'll say, well, I'm a designer. And in the best cases, someone will say, oh, a designer, that's awesome. Do you do fashion? I've totally seen that on TV. And I'll be like, no, but I know some fashion designers, and that doesn't get you very far. Sometimes, on a good day, they'll be like, oh, do you do interiors? Because I've seen that on TV. And you're like, no, that's actually not what I do as well. Then, on bad days, sometimes people say, oh, I once saw a movie about an architect. Are you an architect? And I'm like, yeah, I'm an architect. That's actually my background. But that's not the way I think about design, and that's not what I design. And so then the next question becomes, well, what do you design? What are the things that you actually make? And I have to say, at IDEO, it's a little tough, because the things we make are pretty abstract. The way I think about it is often we're grappling with situations where our clients don't quite know what to make next, or are in a situation where they're slightly broken, or sometimes maybe broken. So I just recently moved to New York. The last 2 years have been a really interesting series of conversations. One of my favorite is how you'll get publishing industries, for instance, and they'll say, we think we're on the verge of maybe having a crisis. And we're like, actually, you may be in crisis already. But it actually plays out across a bunch of places. The reality is right now, the world is being more disrupted than ever before. We're seeing kind of crisis happening in many, many, many different places. Publishing is an example in the private sector, but we've seen it for years in healthcare, especially in the United States, and we're still kind of in the midst of inventing and reinventing what healthcare is going to be. I've had the opportunity to work with federal judges in the United States, which I have to be honest, if you're trying to kind of impress a group of people, judges are really, really easy, because most of them have never left the courtroom. So they're all like, wait, there's Twitter? People can actually tweet about, courts? It's like there's really a lot to learn around that. Most of the work that I've done recently has been focusing on government and looking at how design can actually impact large-scale systems. This is not people we've worked with directly. However, I do tell this story because one of my kind of favorite moments was about 1.5 years ago. We were working with the Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister of Greece, actually focusing on thinking about how you could actually innovate out of crisis. We were just starting this work. And I remember being at dinner with the Prime Minister, and we're sitting at this kind of taverna, and he's surrounded by bodyguards, and his phone kept ringing. And I kept saying, hey, maybe you want to answer that? Like, you're the Prime Minister, it's probably pretty important. And he'd be like, no, no, no. And they kept coming back and saying, oh, maybe you want to answer the phone. And I was like, I think you should answer the phone. And finally he said, oh, it's Mubarak. He wants like Al Jazeera off his back. And basically he's trying to get me to help him with that. So the reality is, what's interesting is, at that point they were in crisis. Now, of course, they've totally had to reinvent in Greece. The world is changing so radically. And there seems to be an opportunity now to think about how design impacts everything that we do. And so the way I like to think about it is, when we talk about design at IDEO, we talk about design as thinking really carefully about the things that we put in the world. And the reality is, now more than ever, we have to think about that actually everything needs to be thought about in really careful ways. And the practices of designers applies to almost everything that we do. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is not about the work that we do in the world of design, but actually the work that we see out in the world that best represents the practices of design. And so the point is, I'm hoping that we can come out thinking about how we all can be designers and all embody the activities of designers. So I'm going to start by talking about 3 basic design practices, and hopefully share that with you, and we'll have a conversation a little bit at the end. The first thing we believe is that in order to design something, you have to be really careful about observing the world, really looking and really understanding your context as much as possible. And that seems easy, right? But the reality is it's actually hard. For most of us now, it's harder and harder to pay attention, to look, and to listen. As I said, I moved to New York, and it's amazing anybody makes it through the city alive during the day, because mostly everybody who's walking down the street is texting while they're actually walking. And what's funny is there's even people who they're retro not paying attention because they're walking down the street reading a book. You know, basically nobody wants to pay attention to the city. They're all trying to tune it out. Simultaneously, if you think about the world of listening, we're not that good at it. In fact, we're getting worse and worse at it. How often do you sit in meetings waiting to talk? And the reality is, if you look at our school system, we've been trained to think that way, right? I mean, the whole notion of a classroom is raising your hand and waiting for your turn to talk, not listening to the person who is talking in before you. And so the reality is that we need to think pretty seriously about looking and listening. And these are foundational behaviors of a designer, and they frankly should be foundational behaviors of all people. And how often do we not do it? So one thing I would just challenge everybody to do is just go out immediately and think about how they pay attention more to the world around them. That doesn't mean that you go out and ask people what you should make, or go out and ask people what the future holds. In fact, we believe that if you're good at listening and good at observing and good at looking at the world, you often don't have to ask. And in fact, if you do ask, it can be a bit confusing. So this is a story I love to tell. It's actually from, it was ripped from the headlines of the New York Times, but it came out about a couple years ago. And the story was about the music industry and how specifically in the world of radio broadcasting, when they would go out and do surveys, which radio broadcasting is really good at doing public surveys, they would always ask a series of questions. One of them being, what's the kind of music you listen to with friends? One of them being, what's the kind of music you listen to when you're alone or in the car or at home by yourself? And that's a really critical question, because basically that's when the radio believes they have you, the radio industry. So when they ask that question, what kind of music do you listen to when you're at home alone? I guess, what do you think people say? Anyone want to guess what kind of music? That's right. Someone said here, classical music. There was a huge hint, by the way, on the screen. So great, but the reality is almost everyone says classical music, which is funny, because if you're a classical music radio station, you're like, that's not true. We know for a fact that nobody's listening to us. And so what's interesting is, when you think about asking people what kind of music they listen to at home, even if it's done on a survey, what happens is people kind of default to their best selves, the person they want to be. And so what they land at is classical music, because that feels like the right thing. This story was really interesting. It was about a little piece of technology you could wear on your belt that listened to what you listened to. And so what was interesting is what they found is that when people were actually just listening, when the device was listening to what people listened to, the number one thing that people were listening to at that time was Celine Dion. So, yay, Canada. But so just thought I'd throw that out there. Another example, actually from our work, is working with a large-scale educator. And one of the things that that client came to us with was the assumption that people don't read now. And actually, when you go out and ask people whether they read, they'll say, oh yeah, no, that's not the way I learn. I actually don't read. It's not something I think about a lot. I wish I read more, but I don't. So what's interesting is when we went out into the field and spent time with people, understanding them in context, we would ask them the question of whether they would read, and they would say, no, I don't read. I really wish I would, but it's just not the way I kind of get my information. And then we'd walk around their house, and there was one point where we were walking around the house of a woman who basically said she had never really read. And we walk into her bedroom, and on the walls was a full bookshelf of every Twilight book. Every book where a vampire had sex with a werewolf was basically on her wall. And that's a lot, by the way. And so what's funny is that she was like, oh, I don't think of that as reading. That's not really reading. That's something else. And the reality is, it is reading, and there's a lot to learn from understanding what it was that she read. And so it's that kind of nuance we want to get at when we're out in the field and understanding directly by direct observation. I'm going to tell you a really simple story. Actually, always put a cute dog in your presentation. That's the first rule of good design. I'm gonna tell you a really basic story, but it's a great example of how kind of spending time and really observing firsthand can kind of unpack the world in a really different way. And this is a great little store in the West Village in New York, and it's called Le Petit Puppy. And often when we're kind of talking about people understanding systems, we'll take them, clients, to Le Petit Puppy and kind of say, what's going on here? And what's interesting is any time of the year, really great in spring and summer, you'll go to Le Petit Puppy, and there's a giant crowd of people around this puppy store in the windows. Like, they're all looking at the window. And it's interesting, if you ask somebody, well, what's happening here? They'll say, well, that's obvious. There's cute puppies. Everybody loves cute puppies, so they all want to kind of gather and watch these cute puppies. And that's the truth. If you spend about a minute or two, what you'll see is people love to watch cute puppies, and so people are gathering around that. If you spend longer, so we'll say, sit for a while, spend 5, 10 minutes, watch the people who are kind of in the windows. What you start to see is that there are people who are coming up to the window to see a cute puppy. That's what they're doing. And then there are other people who are looking at the people who are looking at the puppies. And what they want to do is pick up the people who are looking at the cute puppies. Because if you think about it, if you're looking at a cute puppy and then you look up at this kind of stranger next to you, you've got the love of that puppy, and suddenly that's it. You're like totally, like you found the love of your life right next to you. So it's a really smart strategy. It's just like putting a puppy in your presentation. So what's interesting is if you spend about 5 to 7 to 10 minutes, what you see is there are people looking at cute puppies, and then there are people who are trying to pick up the people looking at cute puppies. So there's a little system going on there. Then, if you stay longer, which is hard to do, but you spend 15 minutes or 20 minutes, what you start to notice is that there's a whole other system that's happening, which is that there are people who are looking at cute puppies, there are people who are trying to pick up the people who are looking at cute puppies, and then there are people who are watching the people trying to pick up the people looking at the cute puppies. There's a whole ecosystem that only gets unpacked if you spend about 15 minutes watching it. The store realized it because they put on the outside of the store a park bench, not facing out into the street or the park, but facing in so you can better watch the people picking up people looking at puppies. So the reality is, in order to really understand the world, you need to spend time in it. You need to really watch it. You need to really engage with it in a deep way, not just assume that you know what the story is. So go deep, spend time, really observe. One of the most powerful tools we have in the world as people is empathy. The ability to begin to understand people by beginning to understand the things that we feel ourselves. And often when we're working in situations where we're trying to get someone to understand how to best design for their consumer or their client or the citizen, what we ask them to do is really work on building empathy for those people. Building empathy for the people that you're actually designing for. One of the things that I actually believe is that you're a better designer if you love the people you're designing for. And that's kind of weird. It's weird to use the word love when you're thinking about kind of the design practice, but you actually get better work when you sort of fall in love with the people you're building for. This is an example of a project that we were doing with a large weight loss company that actually built most of its weight loss around meetings. So you would actually meet with people and kind of spend time and kind of talk about your weight loss plans. What was interesting is when we started working with them, the client was like, we don't want to touch the meetings because the meetings work really well. Everybody's really comfortable there. What we saw really clearly is that actually very quickly you could see that actually the meetings weren't very comfortable. It was really hard to go into a meeting. It was hard to kind of go in as a stranger and spend time with strangers and talk about intimate things. But it was really also difficult to get the client in this case to believe that meetings were difficult or hard. So one of the things we did is we were doing research in Dallas. And we had the client with us, and we were going out into the field. And one of the things we thought we would do is say, let's spend time at one of the best meetings we've ever been to. And we think there's amazing mega churches all over on the outside of Dallas. There's these massive mega churches where 30,000 people will go to pray on an evening. And we were like, we think there's amazing meetings happening there. We should go see it. So the client was like, great. We got a car. It was the service was around 6:30. We were going to have dinner around 7:30 or 8. We basically started driving off to this mega church. As we're driving with the client in the car, we're moving along, and as we're getting closer, you can actually begin to see traffic backing up on the highway. And our driver's like, oh, well, that's actually people who are waiting in line for the church. That it was actually causing traffic jams on the freeway itself. So that was really interesting, and you could see the client getting a little nervous, and they were saying, oh, one thing that I'm worried about is if we're going to get caught in a traffic jam, are we going to make it back to the city in time to do dinner? And I have meetings, and there was this kind of conversation about that. And we were like, no, we should at least go for a little bit. We really feel like we can actually understand a lot by going to this meeting. So we go into the traffic, we do the exit, and we're coming into this massive parking lot. I mean, it's like a Disney World parking lot in the sense that there's rows and people directing you into the different rows that you're going to go into, and then from there, directing you into this kind of massive mega church. And we can, again, watch the client get kind of nervous, being like, getting out of here is going to be crazy. Like, I don't think we should do this. And we were sort of kind of, no, let's go in. We get out, and we're sort of walking to the church. And you look around, and the reality is most of the people who are walking to the church don't look like us. They don't look like the client. This is Dallas. It's like they look like something else entirely there. And what's fascinating is the client was like, this is disrespectful. If we go in, we're different and we're weird, it's going to stand out. At that point, we stopped, and we said, what are you feeling? And they were feeling like, we really don't want to go in. And we're like, this is exactly what people feel like when they go into your meetings. These are the same kinds of excuses we see people making constantly. So what's interesting is, immediately they were able to shift their mindset and understand that, in fact, it is always hard to go into groups where you don't know people and engage in ways that are kind of quite private and quite open in the same time. So it allowed us to kind of have a whole different experience in doing the work. So that simple act of feeling for the person that you're designing for, of feeling what it feels like, shifted the whole mindset around doing the work. I think this is a powerful thing because, again, it's something we all hold. There's a really great scene in Harold and Maude where Maude is talking to Harold, and Harold's like, how are you so great with people? And she's like, well, they're my species. Of course I'm great with them. And that's important for us to remember when we're designing, is that we're designing for our species. We should have insight into the things that we're doing. So I guess the big thing I want to kind of call out of this section is empathy is a huge tool. And I'm going to talk about, I think you heard that my background was in the world of arts, and this was an artist who I was fascinated with back in the 70s and 80s. And those of you who don't remember, at that point, Manhattan was having a huge garbage crisis. There was there was agony between citizens and garbage workers. And this is an artist named Merle Ukales, and what she did was went out and spent time understanding people in New York and then understanding garbage workers, and began to understand what it would take to think about healing the rift between people in the city and garbage workers. And she spent a lot of time listening to people, spent a lot of time on site, spent a lot of time talking to sanitation workers in the field, and came down to a really simple design solution that she enacted that allowed her to go out to think about slowly, gradually changing the sanitation system or changing people's perspectives. And it was really simple. All it was recognizing that there was this stigma around sanitation workers, and that the way that most often played out is that people didn't want to touch them. So she spent a year of her life going around and shaking the hand, skin to skin, of every sanitation worker in New York. And this is a picture of her doing it. Had a conversation and shook the hand of somebody who delivered the garbage. And the idea was to show quite specifically that that human contact was enough to begin to break through in that case. And it really relies on you feeling, how would you feel in that situation? What would actually make you feel different about the way you engage? So observing, looking, really looking is a big piece of what a designer does. Actually, though, in some ways, it's the easiest. So that's the first thing that you can kind of get down. It's the translation or the interpretation that actually really becomes important. How can you actually see something and say, oh, wait, I can see how this benefits in a different circumstance. How can I look for analogs? So often we're asking people to think about that translation, that interpretation. At best, we call it stealing, because when you see great design, often it's borrowing something from one place and seeing how it relates to something else. And so I thought I'd give you a couple tips on the ways to think about translation and interpretation. What's interesting about this is that when you think about a lot of the things that we're going to talk about in terms of design and design practices, the reality is kids are often better at this than we are. And we do untrain ourselves at things that actually make us great designers later on. And so often when I'm trying to find great inspiration of design thinking or people thinking in creative contexts, I look not at the 50-year-old, but the 5-year-old as a kind of point of contact. So this is actually an example. So I was sitting in a restaurant with my niece about a year ago, and she was just laughing her ass off. And you know, that's like kids do that, because kids are they seem sort of crazy, but she's like laughing. And I couldn't figure out why. And what we realized is that she had taken this teapot that was on the table and just put 2 drops of soy sauce on it and made the teapot into a face. And she thought that was hysterical. So that's actually, by the way, a really great example of taking something and taking it one step further. So seeing it and then seeing the resemblance to something else. You'll often, it's like the people who see outlets and think it looks like Edward Munch's Scream. You know, it's like if they're laughing at outlets, that's a little strange. But the reality is that translation becomes really important. We do it all the time. We just maybe are not aware of it. So that's one example. My favorite is what we call workarounds, or situations where people kind of redesign the environment for them. This is a great example where somebody who didn't have money used the slot in I don't even think these exist anymore, parking meters, and use that to hold the message, almost like a letter in a letterbox, because you can see it sort of is like that, to kind of send a message to the meter maid or the meter person. The reality is, it's a very simple act of translation that's happening here. We do it all the time, we just might not notice it. One of the things that's really valuable to the designer is to, again, be highly aware of the world that they're in and what they're putting into it. So really understanding and observing the world around them. And you can see tons of examples out in the world. I think there was an opening statement around the fact that we are thinking creatively about every single thing we do in the world. That's actually not always the case. In many cases, there are tons of examples where people are ignoring the context and just doing what they've always done in a situation. And so this is 2 examples, both from museums. I think both examples of places where one didn't really think about the design and the context, and one did. So this first image, which says, "Please do not touch," is from a museum in Washington that has about 8 giant pieces of the Berlin Wall. And I love this sign, because if you read it, says, "In order to maintain the integrity of the Berlin Wall, please do not touch." So there is no integrity in the Berlin Wall. It's not there anymore. It's been taken down. So it's kind of funny. But the reality is, it's just a sign. And frankly, the sign almost invites you to want to touch it. The moment you actually see this in front of the Berlin Wall, you're kind of reaching out. So it's this really interesting thing where you're kind of losing the opportunity of the environment to think about what you could do differently in that case. The other example is one of my favorite museums in the world, and it's the Musée des Chasse et Nature in Paris. And if you haven't had a chance to go, if you are in Paris, go. It's a really small museum, primarily devoted to taxidermy, embroidery of nature scenes, really kind of an esoteric museum, one you wouldn't think would be engaging. But the people who designed that museum, the curators, have thought so thoroughly about what they're designing for, and so thoroughly about the context, that every single piece, every detail of the museum reflects the message they're trying to tell you. It reflects the idea of nature and the role it plays in your life. So this is one of my favorite examples. they have all this beautiful brocade and embroidered furniture throughout the space, all over, and you know, you bring families through that, and the first thing you want to do is, like, kids want to crawl up on that furniture. There's all kinds of, like, people, like, tired people want to sit on it, and so they want to do the same thing that the people who had the Berlin Wall want to do, which is say, don't touch these things, don't sit on these things, these are not for kind of everyday use. And what they did, and I don't know if you can see it, but it's one of my favorite details, is they put on every one of the seats a giant thistle. So basically a giant set of thorns. And what's interesting is everybody goes by the seats and everyone knows instinctively, don't sit. You don't sit on a thistle. You'd be dumb to sit on a thistle. And so it's a really simple and contextual way of explaining the idea of not sitting. So often embracing the context and thinking about how that relates into design can be huge in the kinds of breakthroughs you can have around the work you do. We're always interested in industries that are breaking, as I said, or industries that are kind of having moments of crisis, and especially interested in people who are thinking about how to break out of the patterns they have. And so one of the things we really believe is that when you're designing for the future, you have to be aware of the past. You have to be careful that you just don't bring the past back into what you're doing. Another way to think about this is don't assume the solution. Because something always has been done some way, don't assume it should always be done that way going forward. And this is a great example. This is an interesting project. We see a lot of work in the wine industry, because the wine industry is always focused on how to get more people to drink wine. And often when you sit with people who are kind of in the wine industry, they'll say, what we really need is to take a concierge, or like a wine steward, like someone who would basically be in a restaurant, a good sommelier, and take all that knowledge and put it into wine stores. That we need the kind of sommelier experience. The reality is when you spend time with a sommelier, you realize that's not comfortable. That most people are really afraid of sommeliers. That's actually not something to borrow from. That's just the way things have always been done. So this is an example of a store that I love that's a wine store called Valhalla. And the idea was to basically teach about wine, but do it in all the ways that were kind of unexpected, so to break with all the precedents. And so what I love about this is that the first thing that the wine store realized about wine is that the thing that intimidates people about wine the most is lots of wine. The more wine that's around, the scarier a store is. And so one of the things they did is they took all the wine out of the store except for one bottle of each. So basically they have one table with one bottle of each bottle of wine they carry. The rest of it is back of house because they didn't want to intimidate people by having too much wine in the space. So interesting. The second thing they realized that really intimidated people was the idea that there was a special wine language and you didn't know it. That you didn't understand whether something was jammy or plummy or what that meant. And so what they did is they retranslated wine language. And so on the table, and you can see it in the image, there's a card in front of every single bottle of wine. And in front of every single bottle of wine, there's a description of how that wine tastes. And that wine is, the way it's described is described by a celebrity. So a wine will say something like, this is like Madonna, old and tawny, but still at its peak. Or it'll say, this wine is like Britney Spears, cheap and drinkable, something like that. And here's the thing, it's easy. It's easy. You look at it and you're like, I'm totally feeling like Britney tonight, but I've got people over and I need to think about, more Madonna crowd tomorrow. Whatever that is, it allows you to understand it really simply. So they've kind of broken with wine language, reinvented it. My favorite really simple thing they did is that they realized the other really intimidating thing, especially in a neighborhood wine store, is going back to the same wine store every single night and buying a bottle of wine. Like every time you do it, you're basically like, oh, is this a problem, whatever. So what they do is they have a frequent buyers club, which is literally a Polaroid of people who come in 7 days a week, and they celebrate it. So that's what you're seeing on the wall is everyone who's been there 7 days a week, and they're like, yay, you're our best customers. So really simple things like that. But the reality is almost everything is an example for us to stop and say, are we doing this the way we've always done it because that's just, we don't have the time, or we don't have the will to be creative about it? Or should we really be breaking with the traditions and understanding what to do next? So we think interpretation happens everywhere. One of my favorite examples is Robert Hammond and Joshua, who basically are the founders of the High Line, when they actually realized that they wanted to save the High Line in New York, which was just a set of industrial train tracks that was running through their neighborhood, they had no idea what they wanted to do with it. They were just like, we don't want it to come down. We don't know what we want to do with it. And what's interesting is, if you go back and look at the history of the High Line, is they use design to help people understand how you might translate what's this today to what could it be tomorrow. And so they held tons of design competitions. One of my favorite examples of things that came out is the idea of someone taking all of the High Line and making it into the world's longest pool, which you see here. But the reality is, it was a way to get a bunch of interpretations of what the High Line, these train tracks, could be, and begin to awaken the imagination of the New York population about what the High Line could be and why you want to keep it. And so, oops, sorry. Forward. There we go. And what's interesting is that in the end, what they did is very similar, just one step over from what was currently there. So if you look at the old photos of the High Line, they actually were floating gardens. Nobody was allowed on them. And so with a simple sidestep, they were able to take that and make it into something that was incredibly relevant to what the world needed and what New York needed, which is like a green space in a place where there wasn't one. And doing that was a simple step of translation, a simple step of interpretation. What's really interesting to me right now is seeing the places where they're being stolen from. So this is the low line, which maybe you haven't heard about, but this is basically somebody who's doing the same thing that they did with the High Line, but doing it underground. And this is one of the first prototypes that's looking at how to kind of keep green spaces alive underground. But the idea is, when a good idea is out there, you know it and you will see it. In fact, we're seeing things like the High Line popping up all over, and the reason why is it's a good idea. It's a good idea for our time. So don't be afraid to steal. That's part of the work of designers. The last thing I thought I would end with, and I think it's actually one of the hardest, is we have to be good, if we're going to think like a designer, at practicing bravery, at being bold, at being strong. And that's not always easy. One of the things that we believe is prototypes help, that when you can test something in a small way, it allows you to kind of understand and kind of be slightly brave and get better and braver over time. This is actually from a project that I did work on, which was actually working on voting in Peru. And it's a really great example of a hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that the client came to us with was, people don't vote in Peru because they're not aware of what they need to know about voting. The reality is, if you spend time in Peru, they're highly aware of what the voting options are. I mean, literally, the landscape is littered with information about how to vote and and giving you the background on what you need to know. What we heard when we were out in the field is actually the really simple reason people didn't vote was because they believed the government was corrupt. And guess what? The government was corrupt. It wasn't the main reason why government was slow, but it was actually the reason that people always put on them, was basically saying, oh, it's so slow and bureaucratic because it's a corrupt government. And so we really were interested in looking not at how you actually help people learn about voting, but rather, how do you actually help people believe the government is not corrupt? And we looked at some really interesting examples. One of my favorites is in Lima, there's a big issue with police officers giving tickets that are actually requests for bribes. They're basically asking for money and using it as a form of bribery. So they'll stop you on the street, say you did something wrong, and you'll give them money. And so there was this incredible distrust of the Lima police. And so one of the things they did is they said, well, okay, nobody trusts us. Who in Peru do we trust? And everyone was like, mothers. Everyone trusts mothers. Everyone trusts women, but mothers especially. And so they built a police force in Lima that was made up, it was called Phoenix, and it was made up entirely of women and mothers who basically became the kind of on-the-ground police force. So these are examples, kind of Charlie's Angels, but not quite. And but what's interesting is, right away, the perception of corruption in the police force dropped radically. People began to believe and trust the police force differently. Interestingly, they weren't more trustworthy. In fact, they were as able to bribe and as willing to do it. But the perception dropped, which is interesting. So we went forward and said, let's think about how to kind of test this hypothesis and to test how to fix corruption. We put forward a bunch of ideas. One was take the mayor's plaza, the city hall, and let's paint a report card on the city hall. And they were like, we would never do that. We can't do that. That's not a possibility. Our favorite was a sticker campaign that allowed you to slap stickers on the things that you felt needed to be fixed in Peru. And everyone was like, we wouldn't do that. We respect property. Like, the Peruvians wouldn't be interested in that. But what's interesting is we took that out into the field and we tested it. We actually put these things into the streets and saw what people would do. And my favorite is that when we put these stickers out, we put like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds on the streets, they showed up everywhere. We were in a town called Cusco, and literally over the day you could see them being slapped on the backs of everything. My favorite is police officers slapping them on the back of their friends, other police officers. So they were actually kind of pointing at each other, school doors that were littered with them. So it was a really great example of a small test that allowed us to prove a big hypothesis in this case. So when you can, think about where you can be brave and think about actually how you can test against that. And this is one of my favorite examples. I always talk about it. It's a mayor of Bogota, Colombia, Antonis Macas. And when he took over, Bogota was in quite bad shape. It was in a lot of disarray. And he inherited a ton of real significant issues. However, he thought about everything he did as though he were kind of a designer, in a sense. He thought very creatively about the work that he did. And my favorite example of one of the things that he did is that when he inherited the city, there was a massive issue with traffic fatalities. Everywhere you went, people were being kind of mowed down by police, cars that were kind of making illegal turns. And he did all the things you would expect you to do in that circumstance, which is that they raised the fees on tickets given to people who made illegal turns or who were jaywalking, all those kinds of things. People didn't care. It didn't stop traffic fatalities. It didn't stop jaywalking. It didn't stop illegal driving. And so he stopped. And this goes back to the empathy thing. And he said, okay, let's go back to who we are, Colombians, and what actually matters most to us. Is it money? What matters most? And he sat with a group of people, and they said, well, actually, what we care about most is our pride. Money is one thing, but pride is the thing that we actually, that really matters for us. And so he's like, great. Then let's use that as a jumping off point to think about experiments. And so he tried a very little experiment that actually he put into the field, and a kind of quite brave experiment. And it was this, which is that he replaced all of the police officers and meter maids and the people who are on the street kind of giving tickets, and he replaced them with mimes. And that's what you have here, is a mime. And what they did is, when you did something illegal, when you crossed the street in the wrong way, or whatever, they would chase after you and mock you. So what you see here, this is a great thing here in Cirque du Soleil, but the thing is, in this case, what you have is a mime chasing after someone saying incorrecto down the street. Guess what? Within about 6 months, traffic fatalities had dropped by half, this radical drop in traffic fatalities. It was so good that they gave mime training to other police officers in other areas so they could use mime techniques to actually cause shame with other criminal behaviors. Actually, it's hard to go out in the world in South America now without finding mimes on the corners of any major metropolis. It was a simple thing that shifted, that came from one brave trial, one brave hypothesis. And so don't be afraid when you can to test something. At least test it small and get it out there. I'm going to end with what I think is the most important practice of a designer or any creative thinker. By nature, if we're designers, we're putting things out in the world. And you cannot do that and be pessimistic. You actually have to have hope to be a designer. You have to have optimism. The foundation, this is not Obama, the foundation of design practice is believing in the future and taking that forward. And so the most important thing I think you hold from this morning and to the next couple days is re-embracing the notion of hope and optimism and using that to make your work better. Thank you.
Pour la période de questions, for the Q&A session, please welcome Nadia Lakhdari.
Hey, thanks so much. That was great. That was great. Thank you very much, Fred. So if I can get some lights in the room, we have 3 positions where people can actually go if they would like to ask a question. There's a volunteer you can spot in green. I know it's the first morning and maybe people weren't prepared for it, so I'll start with a few questions for Fred, but if anybody would like to ask one, please feel free. Alors, si vous voulez poser des questions, vous voyez bien les 3 micros qui sont placés là. Thank you so much. It was so fascinating. I actually forgot about everything I wanted to ask you because I was so carried away listening to you talk. But I wanted to come back a bit to IDEO because you have grown to have quite a stellar reputation, and the way you guys work and operate fascinates a lot of people when you look at it from the outside. So one question we hear often is some people think to be really creative in a firm, you have to remain small. There's that rule that you can't have over 100 people, but then you see mammoths like Google and Apple constantly being really creative. So does size matter?
So you're actually asking a question that I think is pretty critical and one that we evaluate pretty constantly, because actually we're quite small. Globally, we're 650 people. I think our impact is outsized to the amount of people we have. But actually, we do think that size matters. I mean, the founder of IDEO based the notion of our locations on being as many people as you could fit onto a school bus. And that was actually, and then after that, you grow another location. And so actually the way we build the organization is in sort of small groups of people, but acting at a large scale. So for us, at least, we believe that it's actually an important piece. But, and part of that's because culture really matters to kind of creating great creative spirit, I think. So we try to keep it small when possible.
Okay, thanks for that. I'll just see if there is anyone there in the room. No, so we'll keep going. It's the first morning. You guys can sort of take, yes, we do have someone there.
That's totally brave, by the way.
Bravo, premier matin, félicitations.
Sorry, excuse me for my lack of voice. I'm a little bit sick. But something you did mention that I was wondering about is what do you see is the role of big data in inventing the future?
It's really interesting. You're hitting on something that we've been talking about a lot right now, which is that I think here's what we're seeing right now, is that big data is playing out everywhere in almost all of our work. And in a sense, it's kind of one of those things where we get to see disruptions as they're occurring. And I would say, 5, 6, 7 years ago, really, you could see the kind of rise of the internet as being a massive disruptor in terms of the way businesses were being delivered and what was going to happen. And much of what's shaken out of that is kind of why we're seeing disruptions in the world we have now. Big data is the next one. It comes up everywhere. And what's interesting, and I'm speaking only for myself, I'm sure there's people at IDEO who are brilliant on this, is we're not sure what it means yet. We know it's huge. We know it's really powerful. Our question is, what do you do with it? And actually, how does it actually become highly human? And we've seen it come to us in kind of big sort of data sets and really interesting kind of numbers. The question is, how do you humanize that and how do you use it? So I would sort of say, for us at least, it's a watch this space and trying to figure out what we want to do with it next.
Merci. On va aller derrière, monsieur at the back.
Hi, Fred.
Hey.
Hi. My question is, what do you think is the main factor that stops people from being great designers? What's the main obstacle for every human being that wants to be a great designer?
So I think there's a couple, actually. And our founder just has a book that's coming out called Creative Confidence. And one of the things that he believes, and I actually have to believe it's true, even from the work that we've seen, some of the things I've talked about, is that in a sense, we're highly creative as children, and at some point we learn to not trust creativeness. We actually kind of unlearn what he calls creative confidence, and I think that's a critical factor. And honestly, what he talks about that we see a lot is people saying, oh, I'm not creative, it's just not what I am, somebody else is that. And I think what that forgets is that the reality is that we all do have creativeness inside of us. The thing I love most about our work is it's not that we get to design, but often with our clients, we unleash the fact that actually most of our clients are quite creative. And forget big business. Nurses, for instance, are amazingly creative. They just don't call it that. So I think it's actually recognizing the kind of that creative aspect, I think. I will say, I think the other thing, and it's why we sort of start with the idea of looking, is that often what keeps us from being creative is tuning out the world. And it can happen in ways where you're so tuned into your work and your business that you miss all the things that are happening around you. And so I would say the first good creative practice is just getting really awakened to the world that's going on around you and borrowing as much from that as possible. Just some answers.
Thank
you very much.
I'm really sorry. I know we had a slow start. We're out of time now, so the next question and answer session, you guys will be ready. And I think, Fred, are you around with us for part of the day?
Yeah.
So if you see Fred walking around having coffee, just jump on him and ask your questions a
Don't
bit later
jump on
in
me,
the day.
but yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much,
Thanks.
Fred, for
Bye-bye.
joining us. Thank you.